I spent 7 years supporting my wife's career and putting mine on hold. Then, I found out about her and her colleague. What happened next, I did not expect. For 7 years, I was the one who picked up the slack. I cooked, I managed the house, I turned down opportunities so she wouldn't have to. I did it because I believed in us, in the idea that two people could take turns carrying the weight and that when my turn came, she'd be there. She wasn't there. She was with someone she worked with, had been for 14 months, and the man she was building a future with while I was building hers was someone who sat 10 feet from her desk every single day. That was 3 years ago. I want to tell you what those 3 years looked like. All of them, including the part where I finally stopped waiting for my turn and just took it. My name is Daniel. I'm 37. I was married to a woman named Claire for 7 years. We met at 27, both of us in tech. I was a software engineer. She was a product manager at the same company. We were good at our jobs and ambitious in similar ways. And when we got together, it felt like a natural alignment of two people pointed in the same direction. The decision to prioritize her career first was mutual. That's important to say because I've spent time revisiting it, and it was genuinely mutual. She had a specific opportunity at a startup that required full commitment, a real shot at something significant, and we both agreed that I would take the steadier path while she took the bigger swing. The plan was that we'd rotate. Once she was established, she'd support my next move. We talked about it explicitly. I believed it completely. Over the next 7 years, I turned down 2 senior engineering roles that would have required relocation. I passed on a startup offer that, as it turned out, would have made me considerably wealthy. The company was acquired 3 years later for a number that still makes me wince slightly when I think about it. I took a comfortable job at a stable company that paid well and demanded little, which left me with energy and flexibility to be the one who managed our life. I cooked most dinners. I handled the logistics. When Claire had a product launch or a board presentation, I cleared whatever was in my way and made sure she had what she needed. I was not resentful. I want to be clear about that. Not performing equanimity. Actually not resentful. I had made the choice with full information, and I believed in what we were building. I was proud of what Claire was accomplishing. I went to her company events and meant the congratulations I offered. What I didn't know was that approximately 14 months before I found out, she had started spending significant time with a colleague named Owen. A senior director at her firm, 10 years older, the kind of man who had the specific confidence of someone who had succeeded at things for long enough that it had become structural rather than performed. She had mentioned him, professionally, neutrally, the way you mention people from work. I had registered him as a name and nothing more. I was wrong to register him as nothing more. It was a Thursday evening in April. Claire was at what she described as a team dinner, a regular enough occurrence in her world that I didn't give it particular thought. I was home, working on a side project I'd been picking at for months, when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognize. The message said, "I think you should know about your wife and Owen Park. I'm sorry. I know this isn't easy to receive from a stranger." There was a photo attached. I looked at it for a long time. Then I put my phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a while. The side project was still open on my laptop. Outside, it was an ordinary Thursday evening in April, and the street looked exactly the same as it always did. I picked the phone back up. I messaged the number back asking who they were. They said they were someone who worked at Claire's firm and had seen enough to feel that I deserved to know. They said they were sorry again. Then they stopped responding. I never found out who sent it. I spent some time trying to, and eventually concluded that it didn't matter. The information was real regardless of its source, and the source's motivation was less important than what I did next. What I did next was close my laptop, pour a glass of water I didn't drink, and think very carefully for about 2 hours. When Claire came home at 11, I was in bed with the light off. She came in quietly, assuming I was asleep. I was not asleep. I lay there in the dark, and I listened to the sounds of her moving through our apartment. And I thought, 14 months. 14 months of dinners and logistics and cleared schedules and a side project I'd been half-heartedly picking at because I'd convinced myself this was enough for now. By morning, I had made two decisions. The first, I was not going to confront Claire until I had spoken to an attorney. The second, whatever came after this, I was done waiting for my turn. I spoke to an attorney that Friday, a man named Harris who was thorough and direct and who gave me exactly the framework I needed. California community property law meant the financial picture was relatively clear. What mattered most was documentation and positioning, both of which I spent the following week establishing carefully. I confronted Claire the following Saturday morning. Not as an ambush. I told her I needed to talk, sat her down at the kitchen table, and put my phone between us with the photo on the screen. She looked at it, then at me. Then she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "A week." She asked how I found out. I told her the truth, a message from someone at her firm. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she said something I have thought about many times since. I was going to end it. I said, "When?" She didn't answer that, which was its own answer. We talked for 2 hours. She cried. I didn't, not then, not in front of her, though I want to be honest that I did later alone. Because 7 years is 7 years, and the end of something real deserves to be felt completely. She said things I believed and things I didn't, and things I couldn't tell the difference about. At the end of it, I said that I'd spoken to an attorney and that Harris would be in touch with her attorney, and that I thought we both knew this was where we were. She said, "I'm sorry, Daniel." And I believed that she meant it. I also believed that it didn't change the accounting of what had happened. I said, "I know." And I left to stay at my brother's for the week. The divorce took 4 months. It was not acrimonious. We were both, in the end, adults about it, which I credit to the fact that neither of us wanted to spend years in conflict, and both of us were capable of separating what was fair from what felt satisfying in the short term. The settlement was equitable. I moved into an apartment in a different part of the city and started the process of figuring out what my life looked like when it was organized entirely around my own priorities for the first time in 7 years. The first thing I did was call the startup that had made me an offer 3 years earlier. Not because I expected them to still be hiring. They'd been acquired, the team had dispersed, but because one of the engineers I'd known there had gone on to something new, and I'd stayed loosely in touch. I called him, told him I was available, and asked if he knew of anything worth looking at. He did. A Series A company building developer tools, looking for a senior engineer who could eventually lead a team. The interview process took 3 weeks. The offer was more than I'd made in any previous role. I said yes before the end of the call. I also, in that first year, finished the side project I'd been half-heartedly building for the previous 18 months. It wasn't a company, just a tool I'd built for my own use that I put on GitHub and wrote a short post about. The post got traction in a community I hadn't expected. Within 6 months, the tool had 12,000 users. Within a year, it had enough that I was fielding questions about whether I'd considered making it a product. I had not considered it seriously. I started considering it seriously. I was also, during this period, sleeping better than I had in years, running in the mornings, eating what I wanted when I wanted without coordinating around anyone else's schedule, reading at night without the background awareness of someone else's needs. I had forgotten, in 7 years of structuring my life around a shared project, what it felt like to have a day that was entirely mine to design. The rediscovery of that feeling was not small. I left the startup role after 18 months, not because it wasn't good, it was good, but because the side project had become something that needed more than evenings and weekends. I had 2 serious conversations with investors, both of which went further than I expected. The second one resulted in a seed round that was enough to hire 2 engineers and give myself a runway to build properly. I want to be careful here not to make this sound like a straight line, because it wasn't. There were months where the money was frightening, and the product wasn't where it needed to be, and I sat with my laptop at 11 p.m., questioning whether I'd made a catastrophic mistake. There was a partnership that fell apart badly and cost me 3 months of momentum. There was a version of the product that I shipped and then had to substantially rebuild based on user feedback, which is the kind of experience that tests whether you actually believe in what you're doing or whether you just like the idea of it. I actually believed in what I was doing. That turned out to matter more than I'd have been able to articulate before I needed it to be true. By the end of year 2, the product had paying customers, a team of 5, and a revenue number that had crossed into territory I hadn't let myself imagine when I started. I had also been featured in 2 publications that I would have been reading as a consumer 3 years earlier, which produced a specific surreal quality the first time I saw my name in one of them. I heard about Claire occasionally through the residual social overlap that persists after a divorce, whether you want it to or not. She and Owen had not stayed together. I learned this approximately 8 months after the divorce finalized through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned it without particular emphasis. I received this information and did nothing with it. That chapter was closed in a way that felt complete, and I had no interest in reopening it. What I did think about, what I think about when people ask me how I'm doing and I try to give an honest answer, is the 7 years. Not with anger, not anymore. With something more like clarity. I made genuine choices in good faith, and they didn't produce what I expected them to produce. That's not a story about being cheated out of something, though I was. It's a story about what happens when you finally stop organizing your life around what someone else needs and start organizing it around what you're actually capable of. I was capable of considerably more than I knew. I didn't know because I'd never had to find out. The company closed a Series A 6 months ago. The number is not one I'm going to write here because it still feels slightly unreal, and also because Harris, who remains my attorney, would probably prefer I didn't. What I will say is that it is significantly more than the acquisition number I used to wince about when I thought about the startup offer I passed on 7 years ago. I have stopped wincing about that. I have a team of 11 people who are all better at their specific jobs than I am at those specific jobs, which is exactly how I want it. I spend my time on the things only I can do, and I hire for everything else, which is a philosophy I arrived at slowly and now apply without exception. I am in a relationship, a woman named Sarah, who is a structural engineer and who has, I have discovered, extremely strong opinions about load-bearing calculations that she is willing to explain in detail if given any opening whatsoever, which I find genuinely interesting rather than exhausting. We have been together for 8 months. I am not in a hurry about anything, and neither is she, and that shared lack of urgency turns out to be its own kind of foundation. I still cook most of my own dinners, not because I have to, because I like to. That distinction between doing something because it's required and doing it because it's yours turns out to be everything. A few months ago, I ran into someone who knew Claire, a colleague from her firm, someone I'd met at one of the company events I used to attend. He didn't know the details of what had happened, just that we'd divorced. He said, "She talks about you sometimes, you know, mentions what you've built." He said it like it was a nice thing to pass along. I said thanks. I meant it. And then we talked about other things, and I drove home and made dinner and worked on something I was excited about until midnight because nobody needed me to be anywhere else. That's the whole story. It doesn't have a villain ending. No dramatic confrontation. No public reckoning. No moment where anyone got what they deserved in a satisfying, visible way. What it has instead is this: A man who spent 7 years making himself smaller than he was, who found out that the thing he was making himself smaller for wasn't what he thought it was, and who used that information to stop, just stop, and start over, and find out what he was actually capable of when nobody needed him to be less. It turns out the answer to that question was worth knowing. If the waiting for your turn part hit you, you're not alone. And if you've been making yourself smaller for something that isn't giving back what you're putting in, this is your sign to look at that honestly. If you made it to the end, thank you. Drop a like if this one meant something. Subscribe for more, and I'll see you in the next one.